Hello and welcome. In this section, we will be discussing nutrient requirements for goats. This will include requirements for growing kids, as well as mature does and bucks of different weights and classes. When we think about nutrient requirements for goats, these nutrient requirements will vary based on the sex of the animal, whether they're male, female, or the castrate, the age of that animal, their weight, their stage of production, as well as the environment. So when we think about determining what those requirements are, they will fluctuate throughout the calendar year. And there's also that impact of environment where the value that we could say the textbook would give us may vary slightly depending on where those animals are housed and how they're maintained. If we think about the weight of a doe during the course of the year, the weight of that animal and their body condition score is going to fluctuate throughout the calendar year. And that's depicted here in this chart. On the y-axis, you can see weight change, and the x-axis is months of the year. An animal is going to be at their heaviest weight or highest body condition score at the time of kidding. We expect that animal to be in a body condition score of a 3.5 to a 4 on a 5-point scale. When kidding occurs, there's going to be that immediate loss of that fetal weight. So we're going to see that reduction in weight, and lactation will begin. Now, depending on the operation, lactation could be as short as 60 days. Other operations, lactation may be closer to 120 days or 4 months. But during that lactation period, that doe is likely going to lose weight and lose body condition. This is expected. If the doe is a good mother, if she's a good milker and takes care of those kids, we expect her to lose some body condition during that time period. And that's okay, as long as she doesn't lose too much body condition. So we see that gradual decrease in body weight until weaning. And at weaning, we expect those animals to be in a body condition score of about 2 to 2.5. Once weaning occurs, that animal enters what we call a maintenance time period in their production cycle, where nutrient requirements are quite low, and they have the opportunity to build back body condition and gain weight. So after weaning, you can see a gradual increase in body weight as we approach the breeding season. Now, at the point of breeding, when we expose those bucks to the does, we would like our females to be in a body condition score of about 2.5 to 3. And we'll discuss the reasoning for this in subsequent slides. So we aim for a 2.5 to a 3 at breeding. Once breeding takes place, those animals enter early gestation and mid-gestation. They continue to gain weight. Nutrient requirements increase slightly, but it's not until late gestation that we really see a large increase in those nutrient requirements. So as we enter late gestation, the last 30 to 45 days of pregnancy, we have rapid fetal growth taking place. Those nutrient requirements are quite high. We want that animal to be increased in their body condition, through a 3 to 3.5 and approach that 3.5 to 4 mark so that they're prepared to kid once again. So if we take this and summarize it in the table here, on the first column, I have stage of production. So that's maintenance, we call breeding or flushing. That's that time period around when those animals are going to get bred. Early gestation, late gestation, lactation, and what we call the dry off period, where they go from lactating to a dry animal, a non-lactating animal. I have the duration range listed as well. And so for many of these stages of production, we see a range in how long that period may last. And I have highlighted in red that lactation stage of production because it can be quite variable, whether you wean maybe closer to 60 days, and some folks would prefer to wean a little bit later, closer to 120 days or 4 months of age. And so there's going to be some variation there. And then I listed an average as well. So there's some variation around that lactation time period. That dry off period is going to be generally a week to 2 weeks at most. Maintenance is going to be highly variable depending on the other stages. Breeding and that flushing period is going to be relatively constant. It's generally about a month to a month and a half. And then gestation stays relatively constant as most animals gestate for really the same length, plus or minus a few days. So when we think about nutrients to consider, these are some of those that we need to pay attention to. Energy is very important, and energy will be expressed as total digestible nutrients, or TDN. So if you see TDN referenced in this presentation or subsequent presentations, I'm referring to energy, the amount of energy in that ration. Protein is expressed as crude protein, or CP. And then we have minerals. There's many minerals that are important to production, I will focus primarily on calcium and phosphorus, and I'll provide some reasoning as to why we are so concerned about calcium phosphorus in subsequent presentations and sections of this course. Vitamins A, D, and E are our essential vitamins, and so we need to make sure those are included in the ration or provided in the feedstuffs that those animals are consuming. And obviously, water is the most important nutrient. It can be easily overlooked, but we need to make sure those animals have a clean, fresh, and easy to consume source of water so that they can maintain their level of production. So water is very important to every stage of production for our goats. It's also important to keep in mind that we feed quantities of nutrients, not percentages. I know that many bags of feed, and when we go to the feed store or the feed mill and we look at different types of feeds, it's going to list those nutrients as a percentage. It's going to say, 12% or 14 or 16% feed. And that can be useful. It tells us the concentration of those nutrients within that feed stuff. But when we think about actually meeting those nutrient requirements of the animal, we need to think about it from a quantity standpoint rather than a percentage, because the animal is going to consume a quantity. They're not going to consume a percentage. And it's really about making sure we meet that quantity requirement. And so I can feed a 14%, I can feed less of a 14% ration and get the same amount of protein as I might get feeding a 12% ration, a little bit more of a 12% ration, if that makes sense. And so the percentage may vary. It's really about how much we're feeding and the quantity that's being provided as to whether we meet those requirements or not. So in the next few tables, I will provide the nutrient requirements for various classes of our goats. These tables are going to look very similar. They're formatted in a very similar way. And these are purely for a reference for you to utilize when preparing rations and determining if those nutrient requirements are met. All of these numbers come from the NRC, and these tables are just adapted to this presentation. So here on this slide, we have our maintenance nutrient requirements. So these are daily requirements for mature does of various weights. So you'll see in the first column, we have various weights that would meet mature doe weight. These animals at maintenance are expected to maintain relatively same weight. So our average daily gain is going to be negligible. Then we have dry matter intake. So that's the expected amount of dry matter these animals are going to consume on a daily basis. The next column is our TDN, our total digestible nutrients. And again, a quantity, the quantity that's required. It's also listed as a percentage here in the following column, that TDN requirement as a percentage of dry matter intake. And so that is provided to you as well. In the next three columns, we have our crude protein requirements listed first as a quantity and then as a percentage. And then in our last two columns, we have our quantity of calcium and phosphorus that's required for those does of varying weights at the maintenance stage of production. So the next table I have here is for late gestation. For late gestation, this table formatted very similarly. This is for a mature doe raising twins. And so this is that animal that is in late gestation, last 30 to 45 days of gestation, carrying twins, or what we would expect to be carrying twins. Same weight classes. Here we expect those animals to be gaining some weight. We have rapid fetal development. They need to be gaining body condition at the same time. And so that animal is going to be gaining weight. And if you look at this table, you can see those requirements are higher than that on the previous table. I won't go through each individual column here because I discussed that before, but again, you can use this as a reference. Here next, we have lactation. This is for that same mature doe raising twins. Here during lactation, you'll notice that, as I mentioned previously, we expect our does in lactation to be losing some body weight, losing some body condition. And so we have a negative average daily gain expected during lactation. So despite having very high nutrient requirements, because of that milk production and that demand by those growing kids and nursing, we have a very high nutrient requirement, yet the animal is still losing some body condition. So that would be for lactation. And then I have all that summarized here for a 130-pound doe raising twins. So maintenance, late gestation, and lactation, those are the three key kind of time point stages of production that we can focus on. Early gestation, the requirements aren't going to be that much greater than maintenance. If you kind of use an average between maintenance and late gestation, that should be appropriate for early gestation. And so this covers those primary time points when we really need to focus on our nutritional supply for those animals, and if we need to provide any supplemental feed. So we have maintenance, late gestation, and lactation for this 130-pound doe throughout the production calendar. Again, the same columns as provided before. This just gives it to you in a way to think about it for one individual animal and how those requirements change as we enter different stages of production. That's also provided here in a graphical form. And so I'll explain these graphs a little bit further. In this first one, we have on the y-axis pounds of nutrient. So the first set of bars there would be for dry matter intake. So how much dry matter are those animals going to consume on a daily basis? At maintenance in blue, late gestation in orange, and lactation in gray. So you see, as we go from maintenance to late gestation to lactation, the expected intake is going to increase, is needed to increase to meet those nutrient requirements. When we look at energy or total digestible nutrients there with TDN requirements are relatively low during maintenance. They increase greatly during late gestation. We have an animal that needs to gain body condition, needs to gain body weight, has rapid fetal development and fetal growth taking place at the same time. So we have high energy demands during late gestation, and those energy demands remain relatively high through lactation. And then if we look at crude protein, our protein requirements in the next set of 3 bars, similar trend. We have relatively low protein requirements during maintenance, and then those protein requirements increase during late gestation and lactation. So all of these numbers are given to you as quantities, the quantity needed to meet the demands of that animal. Now, I know some people like to think about it in terms of a concentration or a percentage, and so that's provided here in this graph. Here it shows you in the first set of bars, dry matter intake on a percentage of body weight basis. So on a percentage of that animal's body weight, this is how much we expect them to consume in dry matter. So it's going to vary somewhere between 2 to 3% of their body weight that they're going to consume in dry matter per day. Now, the TDN and the crude protein values here are given as a percentage or on a dry matter basis, so a percentage of their dry matter intake. So that's why it looks, quite a bit higher here. So for TDN, that concentration, the TDN concentration, about 52% of dry matter intake needs to be energy during that maintenance stage of production. Like I said, late gestation, we have high energy demands. That concentration, the energy concentration, needs to increase during late gestation. And then during lactation, on a concentration on a percentage basis, it actually decreases some. And so that would be on a percentage basis, those TDN requirements. Crude protein, kind of similar story, relatively low concentration needed during maintenance, and then that bumps up during late gestation and lactation. So this hopefully provides you with some trends on how those requirements, those demands change throughout the production cycle. Now, I've mentioned the importance of late gestation nutrition a couple of times now, and I want to reiterate that. 2/3 of fetal growth occurs during late gestation. Rumen capacity, the ability to fill that rumen with contents, is going to be compromised by a growing uterus with that fetal development taking place. And so as a result of that, we have concerns for what we call pregnancy toxemia. And so to help correct for this, we need to feed more concentrated feedstuffs. So in the diagrams here, you can see in a normal, in an open doe or a doe during early gestation, that rumen is going to take up a large part of that abdominal cavity. We have a relatively small uterus there depicted in red. And then as we get into late gestation, we have that rapid fetal development taking place. It's taking up a lot more space in the abdomen of that animal. That rumen is a bit restricted, and their ability to fill that rumen, their ability for gut fill is limited. And so while nutrient requirements are increasing, we have very high demand for nutrient requirements during this stage of production. Their ability to actually consume a lot of feed is restricted. So we got to get more nutrients in less space. So we need to feed more concentrated feedstuffs that have a higher concentration of energy and protein during this time period. This table, similar to the others, provides nutrient requirements for mature bucks. So these are mature bucks at various different weights. We expect these bucks to be at a relatively constant body condition with negligible average daily gain. And so you'll see here how those nutrient requirements, change slightly as we get to those heavier body weights for those mature bucks. Now the flushing time period, and I mentioned this previous as well, is that period right around breeding. So the whole idea with what we call flushing is to increase the plane of nutrition prior to and during the beginning of the breeding season to improve the ovulation rates in our females and increase the number of kids produced, the number of kids born. That prolificacy is a driving factor in profitability for small ruminant enterprises. So anything we can do to increase that prolificacy is generally going to be beneficial. So to apply this flushing practice, we start about 2 to 3 weeks prior to buck turnout, and we continue this practice for about 3 weeks after buck turnout. And here we're going to supplement with additional energy. A primary driver of ovulation rate and improving ovulation rate through this flushing practice is by providing that animal with a higher plane of nutrition, a higher quantity of energy supply. So we need to feed feedstuffs that have higher TDN, higher concentrations of TDN. And so we feed these energy feedstuffs, these high energy feedstuffs during this time period. So in total, it's going to be a month to about a month and a half feeding period. We're going to turn bucks out right in the middle of that time period. We're going to supplement with anywhere from about a ½ pound to a pound per head per day of a high energy feedstuff. If you've got a little bit smaller does, ½ pound might be sufficient. If you've got some bigger does, might be closer to a pound per head per day that's needed. Does are going to respond best to this flushing practice if they're in that body condition score 2.5 to 3. A really fat doe, if you provide her with some extra energy, she's already in heavy condition. Her body's not really going to respond to that. She's already fat, and there's not a whole lot of difference that's going to make. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if you have an extremely emaciated doe, a doe that's too thin, her body is just not going to be ready to reproduce. And so she may not respond well either. So we want that animal that's just below average, 2.5 to 3. They're in adequate body condition to reproduce, yet they're still on a little bit of the thinner side, so that when we supply that added nutrition, when we increase that plane of nutrition, they respond very favorably to that and increase that ovulation rate. These next 2 slides will have the nutrient requirements for growing kids, formatted very similarly to our past tables. The first column, we have various weights, and then within those various weights, we have different levels of performance as indicated by varying levels of average daily gain. And so we have goats that might be growing very slow at about 0.06 pounds per day, up to a goat that's gaining, just shy of a ½ pound per day. And then we have the various nutrient requirements for those individuals within those categories. So that energy requirement, the protein demand, is going to increase as we increase body weight and as we increase performance within those different body weight categories. And this simply shows for those kids weighing 65 and 80 pounds, so just getting a little bit heavier, the same information provided here. In this slide, we have that depicted in graphical form. We selected growing kids that are gaining about 1/3 of a pound per day of average daily gain. In the top graph, this looks similar to the graph before for those does that we were discussing. We have pounds of various nutrients that are required for different stages of production. So in the first set of columns there, you'll see that's the expected dry matter intake for that level of performance. For kids weighing 30 pounds, which is depicted in blue, 45 pounds, which is depicted in orange, 65 pounds, which is depicted in gray, and 80 pounds depicted in yellow. So as we get to those heavier body weights, to maintain that 1/3 of a pound per day average daily gain, that dry matter intake needs to increase. In the same way with TDN or our energy requirement, as those kids get heavier, they're gaining at the same rate. Average daily gain is staying constant. As they get to heavier weights, they need more energy to maintain their bodies and maintain that level of performance. And so that TDN, that energy requirement, is going to increase, and protein follows the same trend. As we increase those body weights, that protein requirement is going to increase despite having the same level of performance, maintaining that third of a pound per day. Now, if we look at this on a percentage basis, the trends are going to look a little bit different. In terms of dry matter intake, our dry matter intake on a percentage of body weight basis is actually going to decrease a little bit. When they're very young and light weights, we might be close to 4% of their body weight in daily intake. When we get up to closer to 80 pounds, that might drop to about a 3% of their body weight. So as a percentage of their body weight, the animals are consuming less, but as a quantity, they're actually consuming more. And this is where there can be a little bit confusing between quantities and percentages. We want to make sure we're meeting that quantity requirement rather than just a percentage. When we look at energy now, those energy requirements on a concentration basis. So this is on a dry matter basis. So percentage of TDN relative to dry matter supplied. That TDN concentration needs to be very high at those light weights, at about 30 pounds. As that animal gets to 45, 65, and 80 pounds, those TDN requirements on a percentage basis actually decrease. We go from about 82%, we drop down to 62 to 67% on a percentage basis for TDN requirements, and that stays relatively constant as those animals get heavier. So they get heavier, they need to eat more energy, but on a percentage basis, it actually decreases or maintains, stays relatively constant. Protein, kind of same trend. High protein requirements early on in life. We need about 18% protein for those young kids, those 30-pound kids. And then once we get to 45 pounds and up from there, we're only looking at about 13% protein that's required by those animals. So the actual quantity of protein consumed needs to increase, but on a percentage basis, our feedstuffs can be a little bit lower on a concentration basis for protein as those kids get a bit heavier. I did want to provide some information on vitamin and mineral nutrition as well, because that is very important to maintaining productive animals. We need to make sure we provide a free choice mineral that's specific to the species that we're raising. So if you're raising goats, feed a goat mineral. If you're raising sheep, for example, feed a mineral that's specific for sheep. Providing a mineral in a free choice form is ideal and preferred over mineral blocks, for example. Vitamins A, D, and E are essential. And so we need to make sure that just means that those animals can't produce those vitamins on their own. They need to be supplied to that animal through dietary means. And so we need to make sure those are either being supplemented, they're supplemental feedstuffs, or they're being provided in, say, forages that those animals are consuming or grazing. The B vitamins and vitamin K, those can be synthesized by rumen microbes. So once we have a functional rumen, those vitamins are going to be produced by those microbes in the rumen, but prior to rumen development, those vitamins would need to be supplemented as well. So in our very young kids, those we might need to consider supplementing some of those vitamins if they're not getting it through other dietary sources. Once that rumen is functional, so once that animal gets to 30, 45 days of age, and certainly once they get to 60 days of age, we have a functional rumen, and that animal is going to synthesize the B vitamins, vitamin K on their own, assuming that we have a healthy and functional rumen. Now, if we were to have something that were to disturb or disrupt the health of the rumen, the function of the rumen, then we might short ourselves. That animal might become limited on some of those vitamins. So we need to keep that in mind. Diets must be supplemented for AD&E for our confinement raised kids. So if we're keeping animals inside, if they're not going to be exposed to a grazing environment, we need to make sure that we have supplemental AD&E to make sure we meet those vitamin requirements. So what are those essential vitamins utilized for, and where can we find some of those vitamins? Vitamin A, the beta carotene in green leafy forages can be converted to vitamin A. And so if an animal's out grazing out in that setting, they should be consuming enough vitamin A that we don't need to worry about this too much. Deficiency in vitamin A could result in slow growth, retained placentas, or weak kids. So if you're having some animals that maybe aren't growing as fast as you'd like, maybe you're having some issues with retained placentas or some weak kids when they're born, maybe it's a vitamin A deficiency, and maybe that's something that needs to be explored further. Vitamin E, again, you can find that in green, fresh forages. So if they're out in a grazing environment, vitamin E should be good. If we're feeding harvested forages, so if we have animals, it's winter time, we're feeding harvested forages, then we're going to need to provide some supplemental vitamin E to make sure we're meeting that requirement. If we have a deficiency of vitamin E, we may see what we call white muscle disease. Selenium also plays a part in the development of white muscle disease. So selenium and vitamin E work together in a preventative way to make sure that we don't have white muscle disease issues. So if we have a deficiency of one or the other or both, we may have some issues there. And then vitamin D, our sun-cured hays are an excellent source of vitamin D. So we have animals, inside, away from sunlight or sun-cured hay sources, then we may need to provide some supplemental vitamin D. The stability with vitamin D is poor if we mix it with some of the minerals or limestone. And so we need to keep that in mind, and how that vitamin is being supplied or supplemented to those animals, the form in which that's being supplied needs to be considered. A deficiency could result in rickets in young kids, or we call osteomalacia, in our mature females. So some key points from this section: we need to understand the different stages of production, the appropriate body condition for those given stages of production, and consider the nutrient requirements and how they fluctuate based on the stage of production, the age, the class of those different animals. Think about requirements in terms of quantities rather than percentages, and making sure that we're providing the right quantity of nutrient rather than just maybe the right percentage, because that, again, the quantity may vary at the same percentage. Energy is often the limiting nutrient, especially in pasture-based, forage-based systems. Energy is typically the limiting nutrient. That energy source is vital during flushing. It's vital during late gestation as well as lactation. So making sure we provide enough energy in that diet is going to be critical to make sure animals perform to the level that we expect them to. Protein is also very important, especially during late gestation and lactation. So that's primarily where protein supplementation should be focused. We need to make sure we provide those essential vitamins, A, D, and E. And calcium and phosphorus is very important, and we need to make sure those requirements are met and that the ratio of calcium to phosphorus is correct. And this will be discussed further in subsequent sections. I'd like to mention and thank our sponsors, and that is the end of this section.